You mean that this is not the case?
We are indeed very, very improbable. Because we're so improbable, and all the rest of living things are improbable, we desperately need an explanation which explains that improbability. Now, as you know, evolution by natural selection does exactly that. It does indeed start from very, very simple beginnings, maybe not ultimately simple, but at least much, much simpler beginnings than anything which is produced. And the elegance of the theory is that over millions, billions of years, you get a gradual mounting up of the staircase of improbability. And it all happens gradually. It never makes too big demands, too formidable demands upon our credulity. The sudden conjuring into existence of you or me, or any part of us, would indeed make unreasonable demands on our concept of chance. It couldn't happen. We really, really need a theory which starts from simplicity and makes complexity, makes improbability by gradual degrees. That, as we both agree, is what evolution does. Now, the point where we seem to slightly part company is that I think the same must apply to God. Now, you've said correctly that I can't put a figure on it. I can't put a figure on the eye either. But everybody agrees intuitively that the eye is far too improbable to have suddenly jumped into existence. And I want to say the same about God, and you don't, and I don't understand why not.
I think we have a very interesting disagreement. I'm sorry. I'll try and recapture mine. I think we have a very interesting disagreement here. And one of the points I'd like to try and make is, although it's difficult to understand, that in one sense the Christian understanding of God is above rather than within the natural process. And therefore for me, God is not so much someone who needs to be explained as someone who actually gives a ground of explanation. And so going back to this whole question of how we arrive at any decision about this, I often go back to C.S. Lewis, who once wrote, "I believe in Christianity as I believe the sun has risen, not simply because I see it, but because by it I see everything else." And Lewis's point there, which I think I find quite persuasive, is that belief in a God actually gives you a way of seeing the world which actually makes an awful lot of sense of it. Now, you'd rightly come back and say, well, you know, that does not prove anything, and I concede that point. But nevertheless, I believe that one of the questions we have to face here is what worldview, what way of seeing things actually enables us to make most sense of what we see around us and the implications for our lives. And so in that sense, I would want to say that I invoke God not as something within the natural order, but rather as something that actually makes more sense of the natural order than otherwise might be the case.
It sounds a bit to me like a sort of intellectual conjuring trick. I mean, you kind of conceded the point, but then said, well, if you believe in God, it illuminates everything else. And I could well imagine, for example, that it doesn't just illuminate the natural world for you, but illuminates a kind of internal world where you feel a subjective awareness which you can make sense of by assuming God. However, I think that's moderately weak, and it's even weaker when you're talking about the natural world, because you're still left with my point that it's not just that we don't need God in order to explain the natural world, but he's positively improbable for exactly the same reason as the sudden conjuring into existence of an eye is improbable. So what I'm saying is that the argument of the creationists, and I know you're not one of them, but their argument actually backfires very badly, because the ultimately complex entity, and he has to be even more complex if he's going to do the rest of what you require him to do, which is to illuminate your path, illuminate your internal feelings, to say nothing of answering prayers and forgiving sins and all that kind of thing, plus making a universe. He's really got to be far, far more complicated than an eye, and therefore it's not just that we don't need him to explain the world because we've got evolution. He is improbable for exactly the same reason as there's a sudden jumping into existence of living complexity was improbable before we understood Darwinism. I mean, if you believed in a God who evolved, I'd be much happier. If you said, well, somewhere out in Alpha Centauri there's a superior form of life which is so immensely superior to us that we would call it God, and maybe it even seeded life here, and maybe it beams rays here to protect us and forgive our sins and all that sort of thing, I'd be much happier with that, because I could then say, well, the God actually evolved, and therefore we are no longer bereft of an explanation for his existence. But I don't think you do believe that.
Well, I think you've made some very interesting points. And again, just going...
Hold it there, so I'm so sorry. Just a second. Camera speed.
I think there's some very interesting points there. I think the first point I'd want to make simply is this. I mean, it's not as if I believe in God because I think he's a good explanation. It's that actually I believe in God for a number of reasons, and I find there's this explanatory bonus to us. In other words, that believing in God does give me a way of making sense of things, even though I don't actually think that's the primarily important thing about him. But then you make some very interesting points again about the complexity of God, about where God comes from and so on. And again, those are significant points which must be talked about. But one of the observations I've made is that in talking to natural scientists, I mean, if we look at the split between religious believers and those who don't believe, I mean, it's roughly 50-50 with obviously a number undecided. And so I think I would have to say I don't find the case for atheism compelling on the grounds of natural science at all. I think the issue, as you put, of where God comes from is a very significant question. But from a Christian perspective, that isn't really the question that is to be asked. The idea is that God was there before everything, and in some way God makes things in some way, and as a result of that is the ground of explanation. But as a Christian, I don't need to invoke God to explain why this TV camera works, why things fall from the earth in certain ways. It's much more I understand God to have made a framework which actually is regular and can be understood, and therefore actually in one sense we have this very interesting historical observation that in some way Christianity may have catalyzed the emergence of the natural sciences by stressing the regularity of the created order, and thus it's in fact it's so amenable to scientific investigation and scientific explanation.
That, of course, could be a historically valid point, and I don't know enough history to judge. When you say God didn't come into existence but was always there, I find that not really very helpful, because, suppose I go back to my problem of explaining the eye. It would be no kind of answer to say, oh, well, the eye was always there. It would still be something that requires explanation in the sense that anything statistically improbable does. So I don't think you could get away with it with an eye, and I don't really see why you can get away with it with God. I mean, I know that there are other theologians who have attempted to say, to deny the proposition that God is complex at all. I mean, some theologians have suggested that God is ultimately simple. And that would be fine as far as explaining his existence is concerned. I could easily believe that an ultimately simple God's always existed. But then he would not be capable of doing what we expect of him, which is setting up the laws of the universe. And as I said before, to say nothing of all the things like listening to prayers, which require a different order of complexity, but certainly can't be done by anything that's ultimately simple.
Again, you've raised some very interesting questions. And again, you've highlighted some tensions inside Christian theology. And certainly the way of approaching things that I would want to adopt would be this: not to begin with a predetermined or preconceived idea of God. God must be simple or God must be complex, but rather to try and infer what God must be like on the basis of what God has done or in terms of what God has revealed himself to be. And thus, I think the points you make actually might be driven to some extent by a preconceived idea of what God must be like. But I think the whole issue of the emergence of time and so forth does raise some very, very difficult questions. I mean, a perfectly reasonable point we might discuss is where was the universe before it actually began? Because certainly I think the issue here is simply the capacity of the human mind to comprehend some extremely counterintuitive ideas. And I certainly have difficulties in relation to some of these in thinking about God, but I notice they are also there in standard physical accounts of how the universe actually came into being, which require us to think of a time when there was no universe, or indeed think of modern cosmological theories, think of the universe expanding into, well, something. It's in a very, very difficult idea to grasp, but for that reason is not wrong.
I agree with that, and I totally agree with you that there's deep, deep mystery at the base of the universe,